11 hours. That's how long my daughter lay in a hospital bassinet before her father looked at her for the first time. Not because he was stuck in traffic. Not because he was overseas or in surgery or unreachable. He was 40 feet away. In the same hospital. On the same floor. He just didn't come. $14 million. That's the number that was sitting in a trust across town while I was being wheeled into an emergency C-section with glass still in my hair. $14 million that, as it turned out, had a single condition attached to it, a condition my husband didn't know I knew about. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel where the quiet ones finally get their say. If you're new here, I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to cry on camera. That's not how the story ends, and, honestly, it's not how it happened either. What happened was colder than that. Quieter than that. So stay with me, because in 11 hours, everything my husband's family built over 3 generations came down to one old man walking into a hospital room and asking a single question nobody expected him to ask. My name is Elena. This is what happened the night I found out exactly who was standing behind me and exactly who wasn't. I want to tell you who I was before that night because it matters. It explains everything that came after. I was 31 years old. I'd been an actuarial analyst for 8 years, the kind of job where you spend your whole career being right about numbers nobody wants to hear, how long people will live, how much risk costs, what happens when the worst-case scenario stops being hypothetical. I was good at it. I was good at it because I'd been doing it unofficially since I was 14. My father left when I was 11. My mother worked 2 jobs and came home smelling like hospital disinfectant from her night shifts as an aide. I have a younger brother, Marcus, who was 7 when Dad left, and somebody had to be the adult in that house while our mother slept 4 hours a night. That somebody was me. I paid bills before I could legally sign a lease. I learned what a grace period was before I learned algebra. By the time I was 17, I could tell you the difference between a good debt and a bad one, and I could talk a collections agent into a payment plan without my voice shaking. Nobody taught me this. I just became it, the way water becomes the shape of whatever container you pour it into. That's the thing people don't understand about the responsible one in a family. Nobody elects you. Nobody sits you down and says, "Congratulations, you're the one who holds it together now." You just notice, one day, that if you don't do it, nobody will. And by the time you're old enough to say no, saying no feels like letting the whole house collapse. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 26 at a fundraising gala my firm sponsored. He was warm in a way that felt like sunlight after a long winter. He laughed easily. He remembered names. He pulled out chairs. His family owned Whitfield Structural Group, a commercial construction and engineering firm his grandfather Robert had built from a single crew of 6 men in 1968 into a company worth, by the time I entered the picture, somewhere north of $90 million. I didn't marry Daniel for the money. I want to be very clear about that because people will assume it, and I need you to understand it isn't true. I married him because for the first time in my life, someone looked at me like I didn't have to hold anything up. Like I could just sit down. I was wrong about that. But I didn't know it yet. We married when I was 28. Daniel's mother, Vivian, hosted the engagement dinner at her house, a colonial with white columns and a driveway longer than the street I grew up on, and within 20 minutes of meeting me, she'd asked what my father did. Found out he did nothing because he'd left, and rearranged her face into the kind of practiced sympathy that isn't sympathy at all. It's cataloging. Vivian Whitfield cataloged people. She kept a ledger in her head of who was worth cultivating and who was worth managing, and from that first dinner, I understood exactly which column I'd been placed in. Daniel's younger sister, Priya, was different, or she seemed different. Priya laughed at my jokes. Priya hugged me too hard at the wedding and told me she'd always wanted a sister. Priya also, I would learn much later, never once in 5 years said a single word when her mother was cruel to me in front of her. She just went quiet and looked at her plate. I used to think that made her innocent. I don't think that anymore. I think there's a specific kind of guilt that comes from watching and doing nothing, and Priya wore it the whole time, right up until the night it finally caught up with her. And then there was Robert. Daniel's grandfather. The man who built the company with his hands before he ever built it with a balance sheet. Robert Whitfield was 81 years old when I married into that family, and he was the only one of them who ever asked me a question and then actually waited for the answer. At the wedding, while Vivian was busy directing photographers and Daniel was busy being toasted, Robert sat down next to me at the empty end of the head table, poured himself 2 fingers of something amber, and said, "You strike me as someone who's spent her whole life catching things before they fall. That's a hard habit to break, even when you don't have to catch anymore." I didn't understand what he meant then. I understand it completely now. For 5 years, I was, by every visible measure, the good wife. I managed our household finances. Daniel was, despite being the heir to a 9-figure company, remarkably careless with money, the kind of careless that only exists in people who've never once worried it would run out. I organized the Whitfield Christmas parties. I remembered every family member's anniversary, every allergy, every small preference, because that's what I'd always done, held the details so other people didn't have to. And when I got pregnant, at 30, after 18 months of trying and 2 devastating early losses that I mostly grieved alone because Daniel didn't do well with sadness, I thought foolishly, I see now, that a child would be the thing that finally made me family. Not the woman who married in. Not the accountant's kid from the wrong side of town. Family. I was 8 months pregnant with our daughter when I found the first folder. It was an accident, the way these things usually are. I was looking for a stapler in Daniel's home office. He kept a small filing cabinet there, mostly full of golf receipts and old warranty papers, and I found a manila folder tucked behind the hanging files, the kind of hidden that isn't really hiding, just avoiding. Inside was a single document, a summary letter from Halloway and Reeve, the family's estate attorneys, addressed to Daniel. It referenced something called the Whitfield Continuance Trust. I didn't read it closely that day. I was 8 months pregnant, my back hurt, and I genuinely believed, because why wouldn't I, that whatever it was, Daniel would tell me eventually. We were married. We were having a child. There was no reason to think there was anything to hide. I put the folder back exactly where I found it and went to make dinner. I think about that a lot now. How close I came to never looking again. How easy it would have been to let it stay a stapler drawer accident and nothing more. But 3 days later, at a family dinner at Vivian's house, Robert made an offhand comment that snagged in my memory like a thread catching on a nail. "Once the baby's here," he said, looking at Daniel, not at me, "we'll need to talk to Halloway about the continuance clause. Timing matters on that one." Daniel's jaw tightened in a way I'd learned, over 5 years, meant don't ask questions at the table. Vivian changed the subject to the caterer for someone's christening. Priya studied her wine glass. I said nothing. I've always been good at saying nothing. It's a skill. Being the responsible one, you learn to file things away instead of reacting, because reacting costs energy you don't have to spare. But I filed it. And 2 weeks later, alone in the house on a Tuesday afternoon, I went back to that filing cabinet, and this time, I read everything. I never got to finish reading it that day. I photographed 6 pages on my phone. I'll come back to why that mattered, and put the folder back, because I heard Daniel's car in the driveway. 9 days later, on a Thursday in October, I was 38 weeks pregnant and driving home from a prenatal appointment on Route 9, a 2-lane stretch of road I'd driven 100 times. It was 4:40 in the afternoon. The light was doing that low, orange October thing. A delivery truck ran the intersection at Route 9 and Miller Avenue. I remember the horn before I remember the impact. I remember a strange, suspended half-second where I understood, with total clarity, that this was going to be bad, and then I don't remember anything else until a paramedic was cutting my seatbelt and asking me, very loudly, to tell him my name. I was airlifted to Cross Memorial Hospital. I found out later that a nurse in the ER had called Daniel's cell phone at 5:52 p.m. I know the exact time because it's on the hospital intake log. I requested it, months later, for reasons I'll get to. Daniel didn't answer. The nurse left a voicemail. * Your wife has been in a serious car accident. She's being taken into emergency surgery. Please come to Cross Memorial as soon as possible. *. He didn't call back for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I was in emergency surgery for a ruptured placenta, the kind of injury where every minute matters twice, once for the mother, once for the baby. My daughter was delivered at 6:14 p.m., 6 weeks early, weighing 4 pounds 11 ounces. She was breathing on her own, which the surgical team told me afterward was, given everything, close to a miracle. I was unconscious through most of it. I woke up in recovery at around 8:30 that night with a concussion, 41 stitches, a fractured wrist, and a daughter I hadn't yet been allowed to hold because she was in the NICU for observation and I wasn't stable enough to be moved yet. I asked the nurse, the moment I could form full sentences, "Where's my husband?" She hesitated. Nurses are trained not to editorialize, but I watched her decide to anyway. "He was called at 5:52, she said carefully. "He arrived at the hospital at 8:03. He's currently in the waiting area. Not the NICU. Not my recovery room. The waiting area." I want to walk you through this slowly, because the details are the whole point. At 8:15 p.m., a nurse went to the waiting room and told Daniel his daughter was in the NICU, stable, and that he was welcome to go see her. Fathers were permitted, even before mothers, in cases like this. Daniel told her he'd wait until Elena was up for it too. He did not go. At 9:40 p.m., my mother, who lived 90 minutes away and had broken every speed limit getting there, arrived and went straight to the NICU. She held my daughter's hand through the isolette porthole and cried for both of us because I still couldn't get out of bed. At 10:15 p.m., Vivian and Priya arrived. I know this because Priya told me, much later, in a conversation that cost her everything she'd spent 5 years avoiding. Vivian walked into the waiting room, sat down next to Daniel, and the first thing she said, the very first thing, before asking whether I was alive, before asking whether the baby was healthy, was, "Have you called Holloway yet?" I didn't hear this myself. I was 2 floors up, drifting in and out of a concussion haze, wondering where my husband was. But I believe Priya when she told me, because of what happened next, which I did witness, because it happened in my hospital room. At 11:52 p.m., 11 hours and 8 minutes after my C-section began, if we're counting from the moment I went into surgery, my hospital room door opened. It wasn't Daniel. It was Robert. 81 years old, in a cardigan over pajama pants, because Priya had called him and he'd left his house at midnight without changing. He walked in, looked at me bruised, stitched, alone, and looked at the empty bassinet space where my daughter should have been but wasn't, because she was still in the NICU and no one had wheeled her up, because no one had asked. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked the nurse standing near the door, in a voice that I will remember for the rest of my life, because of how quiet and how furious it was at the same time. "Where is my great-granddaughter, and why is her father not in this room?" I'm going to pause the timeline here, because I need to tell you what happened in the days after, when I finally understood what that folder from 9 days earlier had actually meant. Once I was discharged 5 days later, my daughter another 4 days behind me because of her early arrival, I went home to a house where Daniel was present but strange. Attentive in small, performative ways. He held the baby for photos. He didn't hold her at 3 a.m. I asked him once, gently, why he hadn't come to the NICU that first night. "I didn't want to overwhelm you," he said. "I figured your mom had it handled." I didn't argue. I've never been someone who argues in the moment. I file things away. And what I filed away that week was a growing, cold certainty that I needed to finish reading what I'd photographed 9 days before the crash. So I did. 6 pages on my phone, blown up so I could read every clause. The Whitfield Continuance Trust had been established by Robert in 1994, restructured in 2015, and it controlled roughly $14 million in Whitfield Structural Group voting shares, not the whole company. But the controlling interest, the shares that determined who actually ran things when Robert eventually stepped back or passed away. The trust had a succession clause. And the succession clause had a condition I will never forget the exact wording of, because I read it probably 40 times that week, sitting in a nursery, nursing my daughter at 2 a.m. at a nightlight, casting everything gold. Asterisk, should the grantor's grandson, Daniel R. Whitfield, become a father, control of the trust shall pass to Daniel R. Whitfield in full upon the grantor's death or voluntary transfer, provided that Daniel R. Whitfield has demonstrated, in the grantor's sole judgment, the character and presence expected of a Whitfield family steward, specifically, but not limited to, active and documented involvement in the raising of said child from birth. Should the grantor determine this condition unmet, control shall pass instead, in equal shares, to any other lineal descendant demonstrating such character, or, absent such a descendant, to the Whitfield Family Foundation. Asterisk. Robert had written a character clause into a $14 million inheritance. He'd built a company with his hands, and he'd decided, in his 70s, that he wasn't going to hand it to someone who showed up for the company but not for the people. And Vivian knew about it. That's why her first words to Daniel in that waiting room were about calling the lawyer, not about his wife, not about his daughter. Because in Vivian's mind, this was a business event. My car crash was a business event. My daughter's birth was a compliance milestone. I sat in that nursery, my daughter asleep against my chest, and I understood something that took my breath away more than the accident had. Everyone in that family had known, for 9 days at least, exactly what was at stake the night I crashed. And every single one of them, except one, had shown up for the money before they showed up for me. I want to stop here for a second and talk to you directly, because I know some of you watching this have lived some version of what I'm describing. Maybe it wasn't a car crash. Maybe it was a diagnosis, or a layoff, or a death in the family, and you watched, in real time, who actually came and who sent a text that said, thinking of you, and then went back to their day. That moment, the moment you realize the difference between the people who love you and the people who've simply been standing near you, that moment changes something in you permanently. It's not bitter, exactly. It's clarifying. If this story is starting to feel familiar to you, if you've ever been the responsible one in a family that only noticed you when something needed catching, I'd ask you to do one small thing. Hit subscribe and drop a comment with just one word, the name of the person who showed up for you when it counted. I read every comment on these videos, and I promise you, so does this community. You are not the only one who's lived this. Now, back to the story. Because Robert walking into that hospital room at 11:52 p.m. was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. Here's what nobody tells you about family manipulation. It rarely looks like a single dramatic scene. It looks like erosion. 1,000 small waves against the same rock, until one day you look up and the rock is a different shape, and you can't remember exactly which wave did it. In the 6 weeks after my daughter, her name is Adira, by the way, which means strong, and I picked it in the recovery room while Daniel was still in the waiting area, Vivian began what I can only describe as a campaign. It started with concern. You seem exhausted, Elena. Have you thought about a night nurse? Daniel could really use his sleep. He has the Meridian Project bid coming up. It moved to comparison. When Priya had trouble after her miscarriage, she just pushed through it. I do worry sometimes that your generation expects things to be easier. It moved to guilt. Robert's not getting any younger, you know. This whole incident with the hospital, I do think you're being a little hard on Daniel. Men process differently. My husband didn't hold Daniel until he was 3 weeks old, and look how that turned out. Every conversation, Vivian found a way to reframe the 11 hours. It became, in her retelling, an overreaction. A misunderstanding. A story I was choosing to tell a certain way. She never once said the word trust or money directly to me. She was too careful for that, but every conversation orbited back, somehow, to Daniel needing to be given the benefit of the doubt, to the family needing to present a united front, to how important it was, for Robert's sake, that we not create drama right now. Daniel, meanwhile, oscillated between defensive and absent. When I brought up the 11 hours directly, calmly, because I don't do it any other way, he'd say things like, I was in shock, Elena. You weren't the only one traumatized that night. Which was, on its face, not an unreasonable thing for a person to feel. Except he said it while looking at his phone, and except he never once asked how Adira's follow-up NICU appointments had gone, and except 3 weeks after the crash, I found a text thread on the family iPad, the one we all shared for calendar purposes, where Daniel had written to Vivian, *Grandpa's being dramatic about this trust thing. I'll smooth it over. Don't stress about it, *. Smooth it over, not I made a terrible mistake. Not I need to fix this because it's true. Smooth it over. Like I was a wrinkle in a bedsheet. Priya, through all of this, said nothing. She'd visit, hold Adira, tell me she was so glad we're all past the hospital thing now, and go quiet, exactly the way she always had, whenever her mother was in the room. I used to think Priya's silence was weakness. I've since learned it was something closer to complicity dressed up as conflict avoidance, and those are not the same thing, no matter how similar they feel from the inside. The pressure campaign had one clear goal, though it took me weeks to see the shape of it: convince me to tell Robert everything was fine. Convince me to smooth over the 11 hours so Robert wouldn't invoke the character clause. Convince the responsible one to do what she'd always done, absorb the damage quietly so the family could keep functioning. For a while, I almost did it. I want to be honest about that. I sat through a Sunday dinner in November, 6 weeks after the crash, nodding along while Vivian talked about how resilient our family was, how we'd weathered worse, and I felt the old muscle memory kick in. The one from being 11 years old and deciding the house needed someone to hold it together, and deciding that someone was me. But then I looked at Adira, asleep in her car seat carrier under the table, 6 weeks old, 4 pounds 11 ounces the night she was born, and I thought about 11 hours. And I thought, *, I have spent my whole life catching things before they fell. I am not going to teach my daughter that catching everyone else is the price of being loved, *. That was the night I stopped absorbing and started documenting. Robert's 82nd birthday fell on the third Saturday in December, and every year, Vivian hosted a large family dinner for it, extended cousins, longtime family friends, a few members of the Whitfield Structural Group board, because in that family, birthdays were also, quietly, business events. This year, Vivian had a specific reason to want it to go well. 2 days before the dinner, I'd learned, from a small slip Priya made on the phone, the first crack in 5 years of silence, that Robert had scheduled a formal meeting with Holloway and Reeve for the following Monday. The purpose: to finalize whether the continuance clause condition had been met. The dinner, in other words, was Daniel's last audition. I want to describe this scene carefully, because I've thought about it 100 times since, and I think the details matter more than the drama. 22 people at a long table under low gold light. Vivian at the head, orchestrating as always. Robert to her right, quieter than usual, watching more than talking, the way he always did when he was deciding something. Daniel across from me, charming the board members, telling a story about a project bid that made everyone laugh. Priya 2 seats down, not laughing, watching her mother with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something closer to nausea than warmth. I had Adira in a carrier beside me. She was 2 months old by then, and she'd started doing that thing infants do where they lock eyes with you like they already know something you don't. Vivian stood to give a toast to Robert. It was warm, well-rehearsed, full of the kind of sentiment that sounds like love and functions like strategy. She talked about family legacy, about continuity, about how proud Robert must be that Daniel was carrying the Whitfield name into a new generation, with Adira now here to prove it. Carrying the name, to prove it, I remember thinking, even then, how strange it was to hear my daughter's existence described as evidence in a case. And then Vivian did something I hadn't anticipated, though I probably should have. She turned to me, glass raised, and said, with a warmth so practiced it almost fooled me, even after everything, and of course, to Elena, who's handled this whole year, the accident, the recovery, all of it, with such grace. We're so lucky Daniel had you there to lean on. Daniel had me there to lean on. Not, I was in the accident. Not, I nearly died. Not, our daughter spent 9 days in a NICU while her father waited 2 hours to show up. In Vivian's toast, In front of 22 people, including 3 members of the company board, I had been recast in real time as Daniel's support system for his hard year. I felt something in me go very still. Not angry, I want to be clear, I wasn't shaking, I wasn't raising my voice. I was calm in the way I'd always been calm, the way I'd learned to be calm at 11 years old when calm was the only thing that kept a house standing. I stood up. Actually, I said, and the table went quiet the way tables do when someone's tone doesn't match the room. I'd like to correct something, if that's all right. Vivian's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. Elena, sweetheart, this is Robert's night. It is, I said. Which is why I think he deserves the truth, not the toast. I didn't raise my voice once. I want that understood clearly, because this genre, this kind of story, usually gets told with shouting, with someone throwing a glass, with tears streaming down a face while violins swell somewhere unseen. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter, and I think it landed harder because of it. On October 14th, I said, I was in a car accident on Route 9. I was airlifted to Cross Memorial. I delivered a Dira by emergency C-section at 6:14 p.m., 6 weeks early. A nurse called Daniel at 5:52 p.m., before the surgery even began, to tell him his wife had been in a serious accident and was going into emergency surgery. Daniel's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Elena. I'm not finished, I said, still not raising my voice. Daniel arrived at the hospital at 8:03 p.m., 2 hours and 11 minutes after the call. He did not go to the NICU when a nurse told him, at 8:15, that he was welcome to see his daughter. He waited in the waiting room. He was still in the waiting room at 11:52 p.m. when his grandfather arrived because Priya called him and walked into my hospital room to find me alone, with my daughter still 2 floors down in the NICU, because no one had thought to ask for her to be brought up. I looked at Robert. I hadn't planned this next part, not exactly this way, but it came out of me anyway, because 11 hours is a number I will carry for the rest of my life, and I wanted, for once, to say it out loud in a room that couldn't pretend not to hear it. I know about the continuance clause, I said. I know it requires active and documented involvement in the raising of said child from birth. I know Vivian's first question to Daniel in that waiting room, before she asked whether I was alive, was whether he'd called the lawyer. I have the hospital's time-stamped call log. I have the nurse's discharge notes documenting who visited the NICU and when. I have a text message from Daniel to his mother, 3 weeks after the crash, in which he described his own daughter's continuance clause requirements as something he needed to smooth over. The table was absolutely silent. Somewhere near the far end, a board member had gone very interested in his napkin. Vivian recovered first, because Vivian always recovers first. This is a private family matter, and frankly, Elena, airing it at Robert's birthday. Robert's birthday, I said, is exactly why I'm airing it. Because on Monday, he's meeting with Holloway and Reeve to decide whether Daniel met the condition of that trust. And I think, before that meeting, Robert deserves to know what actually happened, not the version where I was gracefully leaning on my husband, but the version where I was alone in a hospital bed for 11 hours while everyone in this family who knew about a $14 million trust made sure the lawyer got called before anyone checked on the baby. I turned to Daniel. This was the only moment my voice changed at all, not louder, just lower, more deliberate. I'm not doing this for the money, Daniel. I never wanted the money. I wanted you to walk into that NICU. That's all I ever wanted. And you didn't. So now I need everyone at this table to stop pretending that not showing up is the same thing as loving someone. I sat back down. I picked Adira's carrier up off the chair beside me, because I didn't want her anywhere near what I suspected was coming next, and I waited. Robert had not said a single word through any of this. He'd sat, hands folded on the table, watching me the way he'd watched me at my wedding 6 years earlier, like someone waiting to see if a thing he suspected was true would finally be confirmed. He stood up slowly. 82 years old, still tall, still steady in a way that made the whole room go quiet without him raising his voice at all. I want to tell you all something, he said, about the night I found out. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not dramatic. He wasn't performing this. He was simply a man who'd come prepared, because Robert Whitfield had spent 60 years in construction, and he did not walk into important meetings without documentation. I got a call from Priya at 11:30 that night, he said. She told me Elena had been in an accident, that the baby had been delivered, and that Daniel was sitting in a waiting room instead of with his family. I got in my car in my pajamas and I drove to that hospital because in my 82 years, I have never once believed that a man who won't show up for his own child in the first hours of her life is a man I should hand a company to. He looked at Daniel now, and his voice, for the first time all night, had an edge in it that I don't think anyone at that table had ever heard from him. I sat with Elena that night, Robert said. I held my great-granddaughter for the first time at 1 a.m. because her father hadn't asked to. And I made a decision that night that I have not shared with anyone until now, not Holloway, not your mother, not you, Daniel. He unfolded the paper. This is a letter of instruction I filed with Holloway and Reeve on October 15th, the morning after the accident. It amends the continuance clause. It states that the character condition will be evaluated not from the date of Adira's birth going forward, as originally written, but retroactively, from the moment I, as grantor, become aware of a qualifying incident. In plain terms, the 11 hours count. They were always going to count. The silence at that table was the kind you could hear. I did not tell any of you this, Robert continued, because I wanted to see, in the weeks that followed, whether Daniel would come to me on his own and tell me the truth about what happened that night. He never did. Instead, I've watched him, and I've watched you, Vivian, spend 6 weeks trying to smooth over. That's the phrase, isn't it, Daniel, from what Elena just read us, trying to smooth over the very thing I was watching to see if you'd own. He turned to Vivian. And you asked him, in that waiting room, before you asked whether your granddaughter was alive, whether the lawyer had been called. Priya told me that too, the same night. I've known for 2 months, Vivian. I let you keep talking anyway, because I wanted to see how far you'd take it. I watched something in Vivian's face collapse that I don't think had ever collapsed in front of other people before. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was closer to the specific horror of realizing you've been performing for an audience that already knew the script was fake. Effective Monday, Robert said, the continuance clause condition is unmet. Control of the trust passes, per the original document's contingency, to the Whitfield Family Foundation, which I will be restructuring, starting this January, with an independent board. Daniel will retain his role at the company on the same terms as any other executive, evaluated on performance, not inheritance. That is not a punishment. That is what should have been true of every family from the beginning, that love isn't a business condition, and neither is money a substitute for showing up. He looked at me last. Elena, he said, and for the first time all night, his voice softened all the way. I am sorry it took my family this long, and it took an accident, for anyone in this room besides you to understand what showing up actually costs and what it's worth. I filed for divorce 11 weeks after that dinner. Not because of the money, I want to say that again, because it matters, but because 11 hours had shown me something about Daniel that 6 years of marriage hadn't fully let me see. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man who had never once, in his entire life, had to choose between comfort and responsibility because someone had always smoothed the choice away for him before he had to make it. I had spent 5 years being that someone. I stopped. Daniel did not contest the divorce aggressively. I think, in some quiet way, he knew what the 11 hours had cost him long before Robert said a word about the trust. He sees Adira every other weekend. He's better at it than I expected, not perfect, but present, in a way he never managed to be before that dinner forced him to look directly at himself. I don't know if that's growth or shame. I've decided it doesn't matter which, as long as Adira gets the version of him that shows up. Vivian stopped speaking to me entirely for almost a year. She sent one email, 8 months after the divorce was finalized, that read, in its entirety, I hope you're both doing well. No apology. I didn't expect one. Some people spend their whole lives cataloging others and never once turn the ledger on themselves. Priya, though, Priya surprised me. 6 months after the dinner, she showed up at my apartment unannounced, sat on my couch, and cried for the first time I'd ever seen from her. She told me she'd known about the waiting room comment for months and said nothing because saying something in her family had never once ended well for the person who said it. "I watched you do it," she told me. "I watched you finally say the thing I've been too scared to say my whole life, and I felt so ashamed I could barely look at you. We're close now, in a way we never quite managed to be when she was performing sisterhood instead of practicing it." She named her own daughter, born the following spring, after my mother. I cried when I found out. It was the first time in a long while I'd let myself. Robert restructured the Whitfield Family Foundation exactly as he said he would. He asked me, 8 months after the dinner, to join the board, not out of guilt. He was very clear about that, but because, in his words, "You're the only person in this family who's ever told me the truth without being asked twice." I said yes. I sit 2 seats down from where Vivian used to sit at those dinners, except now it's a boardroom, and the only thing being cataloged is quarterly grant disbursements to construction apprenticeship programs for young people who remind Robert. He's told me more than once of a 19-year-old with rough hands who started a company in 1968 with nothing but a truck and a promise to himself that he'd never let anyone who worked for him go unpaid. Adira is 2.5 now. She has Daniel's laugh and my stubbornness, and she calls Robert Bobo because she couldn't say great-grandpa at 18 months and it stuck. He picks her up from daycare on Wednesdays. He has never once, in 2.5 years, been late. Here's what I've learned, and it's the thing I most want you to take from this story if you take nothing else. Being the responsible one is not the same thing as being loved. For a long time, I confused the two, because in my childhood, being responsible was the only way I knew to make myself matter in a house that didn't have room for anyone to just be a kid. I carried that confusion into my marriage. I thought if I held everything together long enough, gracefully enough, quietly enough, it would eventually be recognized as love, returned in kind. It doesn't work that way. Showing up isn't a reward you earn by being easy to overlook. It's a choice made in real time, by people who actually see you, and if the people around you only show up after the money's on the line, or after the truth's already been documented, or after someone else forces the issue, that's not love arriving late. That's the absence of it, dressed up in an apology. 11 hours taught me the difference between people who are near you and people who are for you. Robert was for me before I understood what that even meant. Daniel, for a long time, was simply near me, and I mistook the proximity for devotion because I'd never been shown the real thing up close before. If you're the responsible one in your family, the one who catches things, who remembers the anniversaries, who smooths over everyone else's hard years while your own goes quietly unacknowledged, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to stop catching. You are allowed to let something fall once, just to see who actually kneels down to help you pick it up. The people who do are the ones worth keeping. The rest were never really holding on in the first place. Robert Whitfield built a $14 million company on a single, simple principle he never wrote down until an accident forced him to. That character isn't what you say at a birthday dinner. It's what you do in the 11 hours nobody's watching. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one who showed up while everyone else waited for permission, I'd ask you to do 3 things before you go. Subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge so you don't miss the next story. Drop a comment and tell me, who was your Robert? Who showed up for you in your 11 hours? And if you know someone who needs to hear that being the responsible one isn't the same as being loved, share this with them. Thank you for sitting with this story. I'll see you in the next one.